Hey everyone, welcome to Vancity Chats, where we talk to super cool people doing important work in building a clean and fair world. Today, we're talking about what it means to recenter the climate movement and the important role that finance has to play in that. My name is James Infante, my pronouns are he, him, and I'm joined today by two incredible humans. To my right, our first guest, Naisha Khan, climate activist, organizer, co-op developer, all the cool and amazing things. Naisha is a co-founder of Banking on a Better Future, and her most current project is working with a group called Climate Recentered. Naisha, it's so lovely to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here today. And Climate Recentered is an Asian-led group in so-called Surrey. We are working to center community-centered and joyful organizing with community colors leading the charge to build a better world for all.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Today, we're also joined by Emily Pearson, a member of Vancity's Climate Strategy and Performance team. Emily's role is to use the tools of sustainable finance to enable a just transition. Emily, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm excited for this conversation.
Now, before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that we're filming from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I want to pay homage to elders, both past, present, and emerging, for the work that we get to do on these lands. When I think about a conversation on climate justice and investing in climate and our future, we know that destiny cannot be done without focusing and having a lens on decolonization, on truth and reconciliation. And I'm just so grateful that we get to have this conversation in the context that we have now and on the lands whose people we know we have a lot of work to do to reconcile with. So with that in mind, I'm so excited for us to get started in talking about today's topic. As you both know, we're hosting and speaking today on Earth Day, and the theme for Earth Day is to invest in our planet. When you hear that, what does that bring up for you?
I think lately I've been holding a lot of space, thinking about not just investing in our planet, but also investing in our people, and thinking about redistributing resources from the big extractive economy in which we exist in. And specifically in investing in our planet, really holding space for the marginalized people who have been stewards and protecting our Earth for so long. Around 80% of the world's biodiversity is protected by Indigenous peoples. And a lot of the historical climate movement, environmentalist movement, has been so focused on this idea of nature, but not focused on centering the same people that are protecting it, and also the same people who are affected most by the climate impacts. And so I really like to emphasize that protecting and investing in the planet means investing in people.
Emily, when you hear that term and the theme for Earth Day, what comes to mind?
Yeah, really, really strongly echo the points that Naisha's brought up. The thing that I sort of am using, I think, as like this post to guide my thinking in this theme right now is having taking a futurism perspective about what is we're trying to build here and making the investments in the kinds of things that will actually get us to that equitable, low carbon economy, and thinking really critically about where those resources are getting allocated today. Are those going to add up to the things that we actually want to see thrive and grow and be contributing to this kind of world that we want to have in the future? And when we picture about that, it is about the people who have been stewards for decades and are not having places at the table, and who have had been disenfranchised really through colonialism. And it's time we have this opportunity, and we're seeing great examples, I think, too, of investing in new solutions that bring redistribution of resources and power structures and, breaking down traditionally patriarchal capitalistic systems to slowly start to see new ways of doing things unfold. And so when we think about investing, it's a really tough time to have that conversation, to be honest. This economy in our local environment right now is, a lot of people are really struggling. And it might not be that there's that dollar to put into it in a traditional sense of the word invest, but time and energy, and love and, community collaboration, those can be things that we all hold, and as well as our everyday, choices that we make, investing those into the kinds of solutions that we want to see thrive and be a part of that future economy or world. Yeah.
What you both share just resonates with me so deeply. I get this deep sense of both of you being so clear-eyed in your intentions, in what it is that you want to focus your work and your life on, and maybe taking a step back. I'm so curious to know more about where those intentions come from, where those values are placed, and curious about, the path that led you to be so passionate about climate action, about sustainability. Where does that come from, Naisha?
Yeah. I really like to acknowledge my identity. I'm a second generation settler Bangladeshi, so that's where my parents are from. And a lot of that informs my organizing. And so my parents, like, they immigrated here before I was born. And a lot of the reason why they came here was because of colonialism and its effects in South Asia. And so for them to come here as immigrants and then us also act as settlers is something that informs a lot of my organizing in every way that I do. And another aspect of that identity is how in Bangladesh, I've witnessed organizing and sustainable communities in action. I remember when I was like 4 years old and 8 years old, when I would go back to visit, I would hear the local fishermen come to our door with their locally fresh caught seafood. And I just being able to see those economies in action at a local scale, feeding millions of people, is a lot of what informs my organizing. And I think in a sense of what I've been doing more recently, I've been writing environmental poetry since I was like, I don't know, 12 or 13.
Of course.
And after that, I joined, after like the big climate strikes that Greta was holding, or Greta helped start, I joined Sustainabiliteens, did a walkout with my high school, and have just been involved ever since.
Yeah, it resonates with me so much too. I think about the work that I do, how I show up in the world, and much of that is so rooted in our own stories, our history and our shared history. My parents came to these lands from the Philippines, and for similar reasons that you named, in many ways, made a choice that wasn't maybe of their own, to come to these lands, in hopes and dreams of a different and better future for themselves, for me and my brother. And I think about how identity plays such a strong role in how we show up in the world. For me, it's taking an intersectional lens as a queer person, as a young person, as a person of color, that informs my work, who I am, and how I show up, and what's important to me. And you may not need to have those lived experiences to be able to fight and work on these issues, but geez, do they not help in finding solutions that come from different and informed places?
What I find really inspiring about that sort of that turn, your motivation, that why that gets you going, is that it's something pinned in lived experience of something positive, right? It was that moment in action, or that it demonstrated the possibility that that it can exist and has existed for so long, to have regenerative, localized communities that are neighborly and have good, strong relationships to take care of each other. And just some of the things that we constantly strive for in our communities, they have existed for a long time, but we have these other pressures that I think sometimes come in and want to rebuild it all, and they want to make it all seem like it's a brand new idea, whereas we know this, the principles of sustainable community and economy have been here since time immemorial. So there's plenty of examples of reasons that it could be to drive you. It could have been pollution, it could have been flooding, it could have been, famine. There's globally these issues, but I love that it's pulled from something of really positive.
Naisha, I know that you are currently a business student, someone who is just so committed to bringing your values, your hopes around the environment, and using the tools of finance and business to challenge that. I'm so curious what brought you to that interest, and how you see and how you hope your education is going to work in service to that.
It was definitely a choice to to enter business school.
It was a choice.
Yeah.
A choice.
Every time I would do a panel or an interview or something, and they ask me what, I mentioned I'm in UBC, and they're like, "Oh, what are you studying?" And I'm like, "Business," and they go, "Oh." It's just a lot of audible surprise, and a lot of people assume I'm in environmental sciences or something like that. But I think as I've been involved with the climate movement, I was involved when I was in high school, and so something that I witnessed over and over again was a lack of hard financial skills. And so I think I entered business school a lot with keeping that in mind, but also keeping in mind that you need to know the system to take it down. Because especially as I go through business school, I realize how deeply flawed the system is. A story I like to tell is in my first year business class, we had a mandatory class, and it's business ethics, which I like to say is an oxymoron, but we had a project where we had to act as if we were investors and choose whether or not to invest in a fossil fuel project. And the majority of my class chose to invest. And so that was a bit of a moment where I realized that so much needed to change. It's a very hard environment to be in. Sometimes I still have hope because, capitalism is very young. Trade and markets have existed for so long. We've known trade as long as we've existed. And so it doesn't inherently mean bad things to trade. It doesn't mean a market is not inherently bad. And so really keeping that in mind and understanding that new systems can exist, and they have been existing at small scales, through which I do at my work and other places, is what keeps me going and what has been motivating me to continue and finish my degree.
That resonates for me so deeply. I think about the mantra, the statement of, evolution towards revolution. If we are to get to the place where we want to go, we need to be able to take those first and few and small paces forward. How is it that we get there? And what are the steps of evolution in the climate initiatives that you're working on?
There's a lot to think about there. As you mentioned, capitalism's not that old, but the bankers were right there with it, helping to establish those rules of the game. And so there's some really crusty opinions sometimes, and hard to dismantle ways of thinking here. We operate very differently as a credit union. We have been born out of a very different set of values, and those are core to how we do things. But if we're alone as an island making progress, then we're fighting a very, very big piece of work. So we have to start to collaborate in that sector a little bit more. And, where I spend so much of my time, though, is really getting into the nitty gritties of what has to change at a member level for us. So we're looking at where our emissions are in our communities, in our portfolio. And for us, that's a huge portion of that is in our mortgages and in our built environment. So lots of investment has to be made in that space, but lots of mindset changes too, and testing out new initiatives and experiments and financing structures that can help to work to evolve that. Part of playing a role in this community is helping to show that there is a positive business case for low carbon transformations in community, and demonstrating that there's, competitive advantages, there's cost savings, there's a lot of different kind of levers that can be drawn on to help scale. So those are kind of the things that we try to that we're trying to utilize to motivate folks to scale up and to feel compelled to engage with this.
I think back to 2019, just before this little old thing called the pandemic had happened. And, at that time, we saw a rise in young climate activists. You named Greta as being a part of that, and as someone perhaps who you have taken some inspiration from. And I'm so curious to know, as the resident and local Gen Z person at the table, what is it that you think is different for folks your age and for other teens that are passionate about climate action?
I want to start off with a fun fact. Me and Greta actually have the exact same birthday.
Get out. Incredible.
It's very
Incredible. Of course, meant to be. Makes sense. Makes sense. Story checks out.
But as much as I want to acknowledge the hard work that she's done at such a young age, and the fact that she was a catalyst for a lot of widespread attention drawn back to the climate movement, I do want to acknowledge that this work has been an Indigenous-led movement, like Indigenous frontlines. For example, right now, people working on TMX are trying to stop the Trans Mountain expansion. People working on the Wet'suwet'en fighting against the Coastal GasLink pipeline. This work is, yes, a lot of youth. It is youth-centered, but also is built on the backs of those who have come before us, specifically those who are marginalized. I think youth do have an important part to play because obviously we are inheriting the world that is to come. But I don't think youth should be alone in this fight. The climate crisis has arrived. We've seen that with record-breaking heat waves and flooding, even in BC. It's not just a far-off issue. It's something that all of us need to partake in. And honestly, I'm a little tired of people and adults telling us that the youth are going to save the world, because why does it fall on us? When I was in grade 12, I was applying for scholarships, I was applying for university, and I was organizing 15 to 30 hours a week. It was crazy. For us to have that burden instead of just being able to enjoy ourselves is something that I don't fully agree with.
Yes, 100%. When I was in high school, that was even still a phrase, right? It's done. It's over. We don't need the robbing youth of the ability to feel like they have opportunity and space to have joy and freedom and hope, and to not be shouldered with the weight of the world seems logical. And it's just been, it's a really tired slogan now. It's so ridiculous. So turn that phrase around always, every time we have to, just to say that's nice. Yeah, I'll put some work in, but show me what you're doing. Show us what you're bringing to the table with way more resources than this generation as a whole has. It's it's a really
I mean, it brings up
phrase.
Such an important point, right? That if a generation, a person, if someone is alone in this fight, we won't be successful because we need each other. That goes through generations. That goes through gender and sexuality, identities, countries, and people. And so, I'm so curious to hear from both of you. What do you think it'll take to encourage other folks, individuals, organizations, governments, to start to look at investing into our planet more and making choices that prioritize people and our planet?
It is a really great question, and I think a question a lot of us spend a lot of time thinking about. I think a lot of it comes back to building a theory of change and understanding that change starts from the bottom up in a grassroots sense. And it starts with investing in your community and thinking at a community level, looking at municipalities, because when you look at like governments, like municipality is the level of government which impacts your life the most. Once you start creating sustainable communities in which that people are celebrated, in which people feel joyful and hopeful, that other people want to come, and that change will become larger and widespread. And that also has been seen at a larger scale. Like, for example, in Spain, there is the world's largest cult called Mondragon. And that's like a very successful example of how when you create something that people actually want and people actually need, that is meeting people where they are at, it is successful and it resonates with people.
Thinking back to kind of that question still of what helps to inspire, like what are the things that are be catalysts for change and bring, encourage people to organize and invest. Like one of the foundational pieces has to be still a continued education around reconciliation, like because the two are codependent on each other. We cannot have climate action without a better version of reconciliation than we have occurring today. So I think that that's still one of those areas that we need to still see individuals putting time and effort into getting exposure, reading, educating, reading the TRC calls to action, showing up when Indigenous people need other allies. They are alone on a lot of front lines, like the ones that Naisha brought up. And so that, they do put themselves on the line to protect the spaces that they have been stewarding for time immemorial. So
Yeah, I'm interested to hear from you, Naisha, around different innovative, cool ways that you're seeing folks address the climate crisis, and things that maybe are of interest or inspire you to be like, hey, that's a really great idea, and more people should know about it.
I find that like when I look at examples of climate action in our everyday lives, I tend to draw on mutual aid and solidarity, because I think those are better examples of acknowledging the systemic impacts of what caused the climate crisis, such as capitalism, which results also in hyper-individualism and competition, into a more community aspect. Like, I like to really look at like examples like Distro Disco, which is a mobile truck that will redistribute supplies to the community. Other good examples are like even like Raven Trust, which provides legal support to land defenders. Because I find that I'm just like trying to convey myself in a way that makes sense. Because I don't want to say that individual efforts are bad. They are good. But I think we need to reframe the idea that like where I buy my coffee is gonna have like I don't want people to feel bad because they have to go to Mart to afford coffee, because like that's the only place that is cheap and accessible and affordable to them. But they still can take individual action by going to a repair shop and by partaking in mutual aid. And like by mutual aid, that even just means like going to the library and getting a book and having that having that tool and resource just live in the community. Like I like to think of individual action as more as a way of also that I like taking care of yourself and trying to create a microcosm of the world that you want to create within yourself. Not in a guilt or shameful way where you're like, I have to do all of these things to be a good person. Obviously, do as much as you can and do what works for you, and keep in mind that it is not all on you. 76% of global emissions are created by 100 corporations. And a lot of that is also from the West disproportionately. And so just like keeping that in mind, that individual action doesn't necessarily mean, it's just not necessarily the best way to take action.
It makes me think about the theme for Earth Day this year is about investing in our planet. And so, yeah, I'd be so curious to hear from both of you around that, and just like thinking about what cooperatives do best, which is like representing their members.
I think the idea of investing in our planet is very synonymous with investing in our people. Um, and I think cooperatives is a really great example of that because they create little pockets of sustainable structures that enable people to really work within their communities, and all of the profits kind of go back directly to their communities, specifically in worker cooperatives.
Can you explain that? Like, what do you mean when like investments or money goes back? How is that different in other situations in organizations or businesses that aren't cooperatives?
Yeah, so if you just look at the actual types of businesses in so-called Canada, so we have partnerships, sole proprietorships, and like in those, you are like liable to yourself, but like the business is not its own entity, like it's all on you. And then you have corporations and nonprofits where the business is its own entity, like it has its own rights, basically, but you're either liable to an external board of directors or external shareholders. But in a workers' co-op, the workers are who you're liable to. So you're liable to yourself. You still have a business that has its own rights. And like you can have your own bank account, everything like that, but you're still returning all of those profits back to yourself, not to external shareholders like big corporations typically follow. A lot of co-ops also partake in like democratic decision making and equitable shares or equitable profit structures, which is actually how like the two requirements of solid state co-ops, which is where I work, solid state community industries, where I work as a cooperative developer.
You are literally so smart. Like, can you just run
Ripped
my
out
life?
that business 101.
I know,
love
Emily.
that.
Show us how smart you are. Like,
gosh.
What,
Well,
I mean,
I'm
I don't know.
cooperation among cooperatives. Like, that's where the magic really gets to happen.
Mhm.
And that's where, Vancity being a cooperative just sort of gives us this extra permission and like mandate to work with community in a way that is more unique, certainly in financial institutions. So, helping to support and grow co-ops
Yeah.
in our community is one big one.
I was just speaking with a member of the Black Artists Center that's opening in Surrey.
yeah.
Yeah. And so, they too are a cooperative. And you spoke about cooperatives being and the theme for Earth Day around investing in our planet being about investing in people. Can you explain for our audience what you mean about that?
Yeah, I think a lot of that comes back to like the historic roots of the climate movement. If you look historically into the creation of the national parks, for example, something that happened when creating the national parks was the banishing. What's a better word for that?
Just
for
displacement,
the displacement of
living.
indigenous people, so that white people could enjoy nature, but not necessarily in a way that was symbiotic or in a way that we were all part of the one same ecosystem.
Symbiotic. Remember, I'm like not a science person, so
I guess symbiotic's maybe not the right word, but in reality, like over 80% of the world's biodiversity is protected by indigenous people. And when you really like think about those statistics and you think about who's actually protecting and stewarding the land, a lot of that is in relationship with people and nature. And so it's not a separate thing. We are one.
when you talk about these impacts of the climate crisis not occurring equally, what is it that you mean by that?
The climate crisis didn't just happen. Like we didn't just wake up one day and the sea was rising. The climate crisis has occurred as a result of us viewing the earth as an avenue for economic growth, for taking without caution. In that process, that process has been interlinked with racism, with sexism. And so you see that the West has disproportionately contributed to the crisis, but will not equally face the impacts that will occur in places like the global South. My family is from Bangladesh, and we've seen record-breaking flooding occur, and not just my country and surrounding countries as well, where I think 2 or 3 years ago, a fourth of our country was underwater. You're going to see this happen all over the world, where marginalized people will be at the forefront of this crisis.
Thinking about those global systems and the role and work that you do, Emily, at Vancity, can you speak about the role of financial institutions in the climate in the fight against the climate crisis?
Something that we've had, like even ourselves, had a hard reckoning with, but this is systemic across, the financial institutions, is that there have been communities that have been historically left out of the financial system, and that's actually been enabled through discriminatory practices by financial institutions. So not lending to people on reserve because there was various blockages that were in place of that. So we've had to really we're going through a long process of coming to understand how we truly, if we're going to go through with our commitment and be part of our commitment of banking those who are underserved, then we still have improvements to make. One thing we're doing is getting certified with the Progressive Aboriginal Relations Certification, PAR, and that's a really actually tough certification to go through. We have like a lot of steps to get through. They hold you to a high standard to make sure that you can actually follow through in the way that they see as being a progressive partner to Indigenous peoples. But we've finally gotten a proper policy for banking on reserve, and so that allows us to, and we're building relationships with more nations. It comes to it also with being related to the climate crisis, because many Indigenous communities have been at the forefront of the impacts of climate change. So we try to work with, like, definitely in partnership, and just giving the tools, right? Like there's just something that unfortunately we haven't gotten away from, the basics of how financial relationships and financial transactions occur, but there have been people who've not been allowed to use those basic tools of finance. So if we can put those into the hands of Indigenous communities and marginalized communities, then that's really our job being checked, because that allows hopefully those communities to pursue what they need to, and to work in the contracts and the bids and the developments that they want to do.
I know, Naisha, that you're also the co-founder of Banking on a Better Future, and to the point of making connections between things that folks don't necessarily think about when they think about taking care of each other and other people. It's usually pinned against taking care of our planet potentially, and I'm so curious how you made the connection between your focus on the environment and divestment, and how you made a connection to that, and the choices that one can make in their finances.
So I started banking on a better future in grade 12 with some other fellow activists.
Incredible. Did we mention she's only 19? What's
Oh,
happening?
I'm 20 now.
20? Oh my
Yeah.
gosh, right. Happy birthday, April.
A lot of that came out of a general feeling lost in the climate movement, both because of the pandemic, making it unsafe for us to use our usual tactics of like striking, and also seeing how striking didn't really actually lead to any tangible impacts, unfortunately. Despite having such massive turnouts, and seeing how deeply people actually cared about the climate crisis. And so we really took some time to examine what is keeping the fossil fuel industry afloat, and banks came out as a result of that. The big five banks in Canada, which are kind of emblems of the extractive economy, have been pouring billions of dollars into fossil fuels, keeping the industry afloat. So you can see how the fossil fuel industry is literally kept alive by these big financial institutions who typically hoard wealth, who will protect themselves in scenarios of financial crises. And so really keeping that in mind, Banking on a Better Future started as a campaign to pressure big banks in so-called Canada to divest from fossil fuels, and to take that money that is keeping it alive and put it back into community.
Yeah. It sounds like work that Vancity is doing. Emily, can you speak to a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think we cannot overstate the role of financial institutions in our economy and in the role of, or sorry, really the role of financial institutions in the climate crisis. Nearly every dollar in our society has to touch and pass through a financial institution. And so they play such a huge role in enabling positive and negative impacts. And so we have seen that they have historically been tied to various extractive and environmentally damaging industries. Vancity made a commitment on many years ago to not make investments into oil and gas, and really any fossil fuel industry, and we've been really clear in our alignment with that. We also have our investment portfolio. All the funds that we manage are 100% fossil fuel free, and then we're slowly moving towards making all of our really any of our investments in our book fossil fuel free. So we're really always so passionate and driven to continue to play this role in the sector, I think, to demonstrate that you can have a really profitable model for a financial institution that doesn't rely on that. Those types of industries and those types of supporting those types of economies. So our choice is to allocate funds to community. Now, most of what we do is mortgages, and we certainly have a lot of work to do in that book because we have a lot of fossil fuels that are tied to our built world. So we are dedicated, committed to supporting our members to decarbonize those buildings, and advocating for policies that will support that. So often, like the tie to a financial institution comes from your parents or your community, right? And how has that message gone over with Gen Z? That you can speak for Gen Z, but on banking on a better future. How do you find that that's a mystifying or difficult topic to have because it still there's just not that financial literacy with so much of our community for that youth?
Yeah, it's definitely an issue that we've had like recurring. It's like one of the goals of Banking on a Better Future is to promote financial literacy because it is like, I think the language of finance is very mystified on purpose so that it is the most accessible to the people who have the privilege to understand it. And so I think in that sense, like we do really try to acknowledge like intersectionality because, yeah, like you said, a lot of youth, their bank accounts are tied to where their parents' bank accounts are. And so obviously not a lot of people have that agency and that opportunity to move their money. Thankfully, my parents are very understanding of what I do. And so like I had the ability and the agency to move it. Some of my family members still bank with the big banks, but at least like for now, hopefully that'll change.
Yeah.
How was that conversation? Mom, Dad, I have something to share. I would like to move financial institutions.
I also think just like in general, everyone has a role in the climate movement, or in any movement for change and social justice. And so I view like my parents as still really active in the movement because they provide me with the ability to do what I do.
Love that.
And I think like there's so many different ways that people can partake. It's not just it's never just the people you see speaking in public. And like last year in first year of university, I held a protest and I was so stressed, but like I knew at the end of the day that like my friends came through and they showed up, and afterwards we got fun, we just relaxed and watched a movie. And like that piece was so important. And like in terms of like taking action, like show up in the way that you can, and that is just so important that just people are showing up in whatever ways that are accessible and make sense to them.
We've talked a lot about our reflections, last message for the people on the internet. What's your call to action? What do you want people to do after leaving this conversation, after people have watched what we had to share? I'd love to hear from both of you. Maybe that one thing that they can consider taking on as an action after listening.
So I'm going to just say something that was a message from a late colleague of ours, Catherine Ludgate, who was inspiring to many of us in and outside the organization. And she often would say, do all that wonderful, important work during the day, but don't let that all be undone by where your money sleeps at night. So, speaking from the perspective of Vancity, where you bank matters. And that is something that can be done relatively easily. $5, become a member. And that has a massive impact.
Speaking of plugs,
I got a couple.
I didn't get to speak too much on Climate Recentered and what we do, but essentially, Climate Recentered's value lies in its name. We seek to recenter the climate movement to focus on the lived experiences of BIPOC and marginalized folk at the local level, and really taking into consideration sustainable, long-term, joyful organizing that centers hope as well. Because I think that's something that our group has repeatedly seen missing from the broader climate movement. And so I would love for listeners and anyone else to check us out. We have a website and an Instagram, climate.recentered, or climaterecentered.org. Keep an eye out. We're hoping to do some community festivals and like that have like pay what you can grocery stores and pay what you can thrift stores, and local businesses to really center the climate movement and fighting for social justice and fighting for a better world in a community way.
Thank you. I really want to say thank you for putting more burden on yourself than is required, honestly. But the vulnerability and hope and like that centering of hope and joy and just your unenduring, obviously, commitment to this. I appreciate you a lot. And thank you so much for being in this conversation today.
Thank you so much. That is so kind. Yeah. And like, thank you both for like having this conversation today. It's really cool to just like come out and like have a talk about the climate and financial impacts. And I think like the work that you're doing is so important, like having people in these financial institutions putting in the work and like just like I can very clearly see like the effort and the knowledge that you've taken the time to learn and like taking the time to go against the grain, and that's all very like it's also seen and it means a lot.
Naisha, Emily, thank you so much for joining me today in this conversation. To all of our viewers out there, thank you so much for watching. My name is James Infante. Together, we can be a financial force for change. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much.